There it is. Well, good morning, everyone. Before we start, I was telling Professor Krugman, I know he came in harried and worried he was going to be late. I recall a long time when I was in college. One of my best friends was a person by the name of Bill Steiger, who later came to Congress 2 years before I did. Unfortunately, he was on the wrong side of the political aisle, but we remained very good friends. But we were both in a constitutional law class together, and I remember the second day of class, our professor was David Fellman, who was tough. He was like the old character that you saw in the Paper Chase, the old TV series a long while ago. And Fellman had begun his lecture when Bill Steiger walked in about 2 minutes late to the class. And Fellman pulled his glasses down on the end of his nose, looked over at Steiger and said, Mr. Steiger, he said, let me apologize. He said, ordinarily we would have an usher escort you to your seat. Unfortunately, our carnations have not yet arrived. So I got a kick out of it to think that it was the professor who was 2 minutes late rather than the student. But I know how tough it is to get down here. I appreciate you coming, and I appreciate all the panelists being with us here today. Let me simply make a few remarks, ask Mr. Tiart for a couple of remarks, and then turn to our first witness. This subcommittee has a huge amount of work to do, and it is really, I think, the workhorse of our domestic discretionary portion of the budget, certainly in terms of the work that we do in trying to deliver help and services to millions of American families all across the country. And we've had an especially rocky time trying to deal with, first of all, the economic stimulus package and then the omnibus appropriations bill. And now shortly we will have a budget from the new president, and we will have to act on that in short order. But I thought that it would be important to place everything we've been doing as well as everything the president will be doing in his new budget in the proper context. And here's what I mean. Both parties seem to have a narrative about what has happened in the economy. The Republican Party seems by and large to say, well, this was all caused or largely caused by what happened in the housing market, and it's the collapse of housing that has led to this problem. And I think the Democratic narrative seems to be, well, if those guys on Wall Street had just behaved like adults, we would not be in this mess. And I frankly think that both narratives are oversimplified. To me, what has happened, I will agree that those two events were the triggering events that caused a lot of problems in the economy, but I think there's an underlying problem that I would like to see addressed today. And that problem is simply this. From World War II until about 1973, this economy grew in a fairly healthy fashion. And that increased prosperity was shared roughly across the board, regardless of income group. That started to change around the middle 70s. And from 1980 on, we saw a much larger share of income growth go into the pockets of the most well-off 10%. And certainly in this decade, we have seen an even larger share of income growth in the economy go into the pockets of the top 10%. And that has meant that the other 90% have really been struggling to stay even. They've been struggling for table scraps. And I think they tried to maintain their living standard or expand their living standard by borrowing. So they borrowed for lots of things, for education, to pay for health care, to pay for consumer goods, to pay for cars, you name it. And and that house of cards sort of came crashing down when the housing and banking crises and credit crises hit. And so now we have the question not only of how we get out of this recession, but also how we build the kind of economy in which all families can share in what we hope will be the renewed growth in prosperity down the line once this recession is over. And so we're going to have two panels today to talk about that problem, and especially with our first panel this morning, we will have a focus on the inequality that is developed in this society and what might be done to deal with that inequality as we try to dig ourselves out of this recession. And our first witness, Dr. Krugman, will address himself to that. But before he does, I'd like to call on Mr. Tiart for whatever comments he'd like.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to also welcome the witnesses for both panels and welcome Dr. Krugman. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for putting today's hearing together. I think our discussion today will really get to the heart of the philosophical differences in America when it comes to the issues surrounding our economy. There's no question in my mind that everyone in this room wants to return to our country's historic economic success. I think there's considerable disagreement on how we get there, but I think at least we can start with the statement that we all want to end up in the same place, a place where our children can start a business or find a high-quality and high-paying job. Today's discussion indeed will focus the focus of the entire Congress should be on how we renew the dream, the American dream. I do not subscribe to Keynesian economics. Every thin dime Congress spends, or more appropriately borrows, is the function of equivalent of a thick quarter that our children in Kansas and across the rest of America will have to pay back later. And I've yet to see a government job that pays for itself. I don't believe that massive deficit spending on things like comparative effectiveness research, which I believe will lead to rationed health care, or propping up local and state governments, as done by the stimulus bill recently, is going to create the private sector jobs in the short term or revive our economy. All we seem to be creating is more bureaucracy. And as I said, I've yet to see a government job that pays for itself. My view is that one of the very worst things that we can do as Congress is to follow macroeconomic policies that result in raising taxes on American citizens and employers. We have enjoyed economic success in the past in large part because of our relatively low tax rates. To raise taxes will, in my view, not only hurt the American wallets immediately, but also stifle the prospect of economic prosperity in America in the near future. Sadly, this is where the administration is headed. What is even more concerning to me is the discussion of a second stimulus bill. Frankly, I don't think the first one has been around long enough to determine it has had any impact. My view is that the first stimulus bill will not work, not because it isn't big enough, but because it's misguided in its economics. To pass a second stimulus bill that makes the same mistakes as the first seems unwise to me. The President has made a deal out of recently about Republicans being the party of no. Simply not true. We have great ideas that simply have been shut out of the process. And by the way, Chairman, I want to thank you for not shutting us out of this process today. I'm ready to say yes to policies that will help rebuild a sound economy for today and the future. We need to pursue common sense microeconomic policies that work and reduce the uncontrollable costs that people are facing, those who keep and create jobs here in America. And I think it starts by reducing the size and scope of the government that has strangled growth. We need to move towards a competitive business tax whose rates will compete with the rest of the world. Ireland, though it's been caught up in a worldwide downturn, is well poised to recover as it welcomes companies and foster growth. We need desperately to pursue common sense approach to regulation with a cost-based justification of the rules our bureaucrats impose on those who keep and create jobs. We need to be energy independent. I think it's well past the time that we adopt a loser pays approach to litigation, as the United Kingdom follows. And finally, I hope we discuss the rising cost of health care, in addition to ensuring health care access, which is one of the biggest burdens on our economy. I believe a consumer-based approach to health care delivery can benefit patients and the economy. These ideas build the fundamental strength of our economy, and that's how we can renew the dream and renew the opportunity for ourselves and our children. I'd just like to close by saying, although we are struggling today I am confident and optimistic that the American people will overcome this downturn as they always have. My concern is that borrowing and spending will prolong the pain instead of fixing the problem. And I look forward to the discussion today and yield back.
Thank you. Let me simply welcome our first witness, Dr. Paul Krugman. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Krugman is a distinguished Nobel Prize winner and professor of economics at Princeton University. He's also a centenary professor at the London School of Economics and an op-ed columnist for the New York Times, and one of the 50 most influential economists in the world today. His professional reputation rests significantly on his work in international trade and finance. He is the author of or editor of 20 books and more than 200 papers. He's also well known for his work on income distribution and public policy, which is the subject of his remarks largely this morning. I want to mention that we've agreed to let Dr. Krugman go at 11:30 so he can make a prior commitment at the Swedish Embassy. I appreciate you being here, Dr. Krugman. Why don't you proceed with your statement?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay. And thank you, Mr. Tiart. As everyone's aware, this hearing is taking place at a time of economic crisis. Unemployment is rising steeply. The outlook for working Americans is the grimmest it's been since the Great Depression. 2 years ago, few, including myself, imagined that things could get this bad. We all hope that the President's policies can pull the economy out of its tailspin, but even if he does succeed in that goal, that will not be enough. The U.S. economy was failing to serve the needs of the American people, even during the good years of the current business cycle. I find it instructive and depressing to consider the state of the economy for ordinary Americans in 2007, which was as good as it got in recent years. By almost any measure, the economy was worse for a majority of families in 2007 than it had been in 2000. And there was, if you believe the numbers, which I mostly do, surprisingly little progress, even over a much longer period, reaching back 3 decades. So median family income, adjusted for inflation, was actually slightly lower in 2007 than it had been in 2000. And if we go back several decades to 1979, we find that median income rose only 15% over a period of almost 30 years, less than 0.5% annually. Virtually all of that rise, by the way, this is not a partisan point, but just an observation, took place during the Clinton years. That compares with sustained income growth at more than 2% a year during the great post-war boom, post-war generation. The poverty rate in 2007, which was an alleged boom year, was 12.5%. Not only higher than the 11.3% rate in 2000, but higher than the 11.7% rate in 1979. If one believes the numbers, none of America's economic growth over the past generation has trickled down to America's poor. And the health insurance situation worsened substantially. The percentage of the American population without insurance rose sharply in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, sparking an unfortunately failed attempt at health reform. The situation then improved somewhat for a while, thanks to cost control and a booming economy. But since 2000, healthcare costs have once again risen much faster than wages, leading to a growing problem of uninsured Americans, even when the economy is growing. It's almost certain that the current crisis will soon present us with a major crisis of lost healthcare coverage. So why has a growing economy failed to deliver for ordinary Americans? One major reason is growing income inequality. Many of the gains in income went to a small minority of very well-off people, with most workers seeing little rise in real wages. Even using census data, which missed the growth in the highest incomes, average household income rose twice as fast as median household income. That is, income growth over the past 30 years would have been twice as fast if it had not been for growing inequality. There's also a secondary reason for the failure of economic growth to help many Americans, which is our dysfunctional healthcare system. We're unique among advanced countries in not having some form of universal coverage, yet we spend far more to cover 85% of our population than our counterparts spend to cover everyone, with no evidence that we receive correspondingly better care. For both these reasons, there's been a remarkable disconnect between the state of the economy, as measured by the growth of GDP, and the experience of most Americans. And if that disconnect continues, recovering from the current recession, urgent though it is, will still leave major economic problems unsolved. So what can we do to end the disconnect? Reducing income inequality is a difficult task. The truth is that while we have some ideas about what might work, there is little reason to be confident about the efficacy of whatever measures we try. The great compression of the New Deal, which created the middle-class society of the post-war era, the society I grew up in, is an inspiring role model. But in honesty, I can't promise that we know how to repeat that experience. Healthcare reform, on the other hand, is something we know can work. Study after study has demonstrated that the U.S. healthcare system isn't just harsh and unfair, it's highly inefficient. We have extremely high administrative costs, largely because insurers work so hard not to cover the people who need insurance most. We lag in the use of information technology. We have a combination of inadequate care for many Americans and vast spending on dubiously effective care for many other Americans. I might also note that our healthcare system underinvests in preventive measures that could save money as well as lives. A reasonable estimate is that successful health reform could eventually save several percent of GDP while substantially improving the lives of most Americans. As anyone who's studied proposals to promote economic growth knows, that's huge. Even a drastic increase in private investment achieved by whatever means would be highly unlikely to yield that big a result. Can we afford healthcare reform in the face of projected large fiscal deficits? To borrow a phrase, yes, we can. In fact, we must. First of all, there's no reason to be concerned about the level of deficits per se, the dollar figure per year in the near term, by which I mean the period likely to extend for 3 or 4 years before the economy recovers. In normal times, there is reason to worry that deficits will crowd out private investment and raise interest rates. In the current situation, however, the world economy is in effect suffering from an excess of desired saving. Even at a zero interest rate, businesses aren't willing or able to invest all the savings the private sector wants to undertake. As a result, government deficits actually stimulate economic activity in the current situation by giving those savings a place to go. Those deficits do not crowd out private investment. In fact, they may well crowd it in. We do need to worry about government debt. There are real concerns about the sustainability of very high levels of debt in the future. However, we need to realize, even though this sounds striking, maybe a little crazy, that $1 trillion more or less of debt over the next decade is virtually irrelevant to America's long-term fiscal position. That position is instead dominated by the rising projected costs of our entitlement programs, mainly Medicare and Medicaid. And the only way to rein in Medicare and Medicaid costs is through a thorough reform of our healthcare system. To put off healthcare reform out of fear of deficits would be a monstrous case of being penny-wise and pound-foolish, sacrificing the nation's long-run fiscal prospects for the sake of holding current numbers below some artificial threshold. In dealing with the deficit and also in dealing with healthcare, we need to take the long view. And that long view says that we should proceed with massive reform now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Krugman. Let me ask a couple of questions. As you know, we have passed a significant budget stimulus package, and there are those who feel that that is a significant mistake because it adds to the deficit. You've indicated in your testimony that what we ought to be focused on is not the near-term, year-by-year deficit, but the long-term level of debt, and that, in fact, in the short term, deficits may, in fact, be essential in order to prevent the worsening of the economic situation. We now have the Budget Committee about to mark up a budget resolution for the year. The Budget Committee process is fairly interesting. It's the only process I know where you can cut budgets without cutting programs, because they don't have to tie macroeconomic decisions to micro results. And there are those who will say that now that we passed an economic stimulus package about a month ago, we need to scale back on the size of expenditures and scale back on deficits next year and the following year. Tell me why you think that would not be a good idea at this time.
We first need to measure the stimulus package against the current needs of the economy. President Obama estimates that his package will, at its peak, add about 3.5 million jobs to what we would otherwise have had. And that seems to be, that estimate is consistent with most economists' ballpark models. That's helpful, but the U.S. economy has already lost almost 4.5 million jobs in this recession, and that's against the backdrop of a growing population. So we're almost 6 million jobs short of where we should be already, and losing jobs at the rate of 600,000 a month. So the package, as it now stands, is mitigating. It's not even enough to prevent us from having a very severe recession. It's just a mitigating factor. If we respond to concern about the size of the package by scaling back other government spending, we're undoing the effects of the stimulus package, making it even more inadequate. And it is really important to bear in mind, to have some sense of what the long-run magnitudes are here. The stimulus package is approximately $800 billion. That's the headline number. Because it will stimulate the economy, some of that comes back in the form of higher tax revenues. A reasonable guess that the true cost is on the order of $500 billion, which is 3% of GDP. That's significant, but it's certainly not make or break if we're thinking about the long-run budget prospects of the United States. And we certainly should not be sacrificing crucial priorities in the interest of offsetting the cost of this very necessary temporary measure.
Another question on the issue of inequality. Why should we be concerned with growing inequality in the economy? I mean, it may offend our sense of fairness and justice, but in terms of the long-term strength of the economy, why should we be concerned if we have growing inequality?
Okay, there are two levels of answer to that. The first is that rising inequality means that the majority of the population gets less than an equal share of economic growth. And I actually addressed that briefly in the opening remarks. If we had not had rising inequality these past 3 decades, and had the same rate of economic growth, the standard of living of the typical family, the median family, would have grown at least twice as fast as it did. It's basically the pie may be growing, but if an ever-growing share of that pie is going to a small group of people, most people end up not seeing their incomes rise as fast as the average. Beyond that, we have more speculative but probably real aspects in which a highly unequal society ends up being a dysfunctional society. There are somewhat abstract but very real issues of trust, sense of community, and there are much more real, I think, economic concerns. If we ask ourselves, how did we get into this financial crisis? An important aspect of it was that players in the financial market were prepared to take huge risks with other people's money because, at least for a while, they could earn extraordinary incomes. The people who defend high inequality say that it creates incentives, which it does. But I think what we just learned is that those incentives are not necessarily incentives to do good things. They can sometimes be incentives to do extremely socially destructive things. If I just say that, look at the historical record, the most equal income distribution the United States has ever had was during the generation following World War II. That was when we truly were a middle-class society, when we were certainly not an egalitarian society. We were not Cuba, but we were a relatively equal society. That was also the era of the greatest economic growth that we've ever achieved, before or since. I don't want to push those things too far. I think the most important, the clearest argument is simply if you have rising inequality, then most people don't share fully in economic growth. But there are reasonably good reasons, looking at the historical record, to think that a highly unequal economy is a worse economy and a worse society.
One last question before I pass the witness. There has been some considerable debate in this country about the relevance of what Roosevelt did in 1937 to the existing situation. As I read history, what happened is that when Roosevelt came into power, we had unemployment approaching 25%, and that Roosevelt took actions to build confidence and provided some modest stimulus, which brought down the unemployment levels to a modest degree. But then after 1936, he seemed to feel that the economy was recovering and on the road back, and he throttled back and tried to turn more toward a balanced budget. And as a result, the economy again dipped, and it took until World War II to really achieve full employment. And the lesson I would draw from that is that it would be a mistake for us to throttle back too soon on stimulating the economy. What's your reaction to that interpretation of those events?
Very much in agreement. What happened in 1937 was a broad resurgence of the old orthodoxy, both about balanced budgets, even in a time of high unemployment, and monetary policy. So there was a shift towards a more contractionary monetary policy as well. And the economy slid back down in what was at the time often referred to as the Second Depression, and did a great deal to undermine the economy as well as the New Deal agenda. We can also look at the Japanese experience in the 1990s, which offers a quite similar story. If we look at the Japanese behavior circa 1996, same thing. They had it's often said that the Japanese policy of public works to support the economy didn't work. Actually, it did when it was pursued. It did expand the economy, but they too had a sudden burst of premature orthodoxy, leading to the Japanese economy slipping back again. So there is a real concern. And one of the great concerns, I may say, about the stimulus bill as written is that it will deliver its peak support to the economy next year and then fade out quite quickly. And there is no solid reason to believe that stimulus will cease to be necessary in 2011. If we look for the CBO's projections show the economy recovering, but that's not a result, it's an assumption. They basically simply imposed the idea that we will return to normalcy 5 years from now. And very hard to see what the forces leading to that return are. So I'm very concerned that we will in fact be deja vu all over again. That just as the Japanese repeated Roosevelt's experience, that we will then repeat the Japanese experience.
Thank you very much. Mr. Tiart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to talk about your statement on rising inequality. I think in looking at those broad categories, we fail to see what has happened during that time with people who were previously in those categories. There has been a mobility of out of the lowest quintile, or people we would consider poor, into the middle class. About 54% moved out of the bottom quartile into either the next quartile or the middle quartile. Quintile. 5 categories instead of 4. So when you just look at the number, because we do have new people coming into the economy, people coming into work now that didn't work before, and that happened during the time period that you're referring. So if you look at the upward mobility, there's been a high rate of people moving out of that bottom quintile into other categories during the same period of time. And I believe that you mentioned the 1950s. It's an interesting study of economics from the Depression up until today, because I think we remained stagnant. There were some ups and downs, but our economy was relatively stagnant during the 30s, where we borrowed a lot, spent a lot. I think it was the capitalization that occurred during World War II and the opportunity when these people came back from World War II, young men and women with a can-do attitude, that took this capital investment that occurred during World War II and came up with new ideas and new innovation, and that's how we saw this expansion of the middle class. So my concern in today, as we move forward, is that we focus on this macro level, and we say, and I believe that 98% of the people in Congress today are macroeconomics and Keynesians. I believe there's very few that look at the microeconomics that build the aggregates that you study in macroeconomics. In order to build that microeconomic concept, we have to go down and look at small businesses, the people who keep and create jobs. In Kansas today, 4 out of 5 jobs are small business jobs. So developing a structure where they can have opportunity is what I'm concerned about. I think that's what builds a strong economy, from the bottom up and not from government down. So, and I look at policies. You mentioned that that there's this massive spending may have some failure in the future. I mean, we'll have a spur in 2010, or a bump in 2010. It could go away in 2011, if I understood your testimony right. If I look at what we're doing today, this year the federal government's going to go out and borrow $3 trillion. And apparently we're not doing too well, because that last week the Fed printed $1 trillion in new money. So we're putting more money into the economy by printing it. What impact does that have on inflation when you imprint money and have more money available in an economy?
Okay, that's a long list of questions. Let me do the best I can. Just first, about income mobility. Yes, we are not a caste society. People do move up and down. However, the extent of those moves is often greatly exaggerated. Yes, there is a changing mix of people, but the last study I've seen says that even after a decade, if we're looking at the top 1% or so of the population, after a decade, most of the top 1% is the same people who were still in the top 1% a decade earlier. We're not actually looking at a situation where it's a constantly changing cast of characters. And perhaps most important for comparisons across time, income mobility has, if anything, probably declined in the United States. So to the extent that we've always been a country in which people move up and down, which somewhat reduces the sort of lifetime inequality of income, that is no more true, and if anything, less true now than it was 40 years ago. So we are
I think if you look at the lifestyle of people in these 5 quintiles, people have a better lifestyle today than they had in the 1950s.
I think there's a substantial illusion in that. I mean, certainly people are better off than they were in the 1950s. And in some respects, there are things.
Well, let me ask you this. And I've been to the poorest area in Kansas. People there live in single-family units. They have refrigerators. They have telephones. They have cable TV. They have microwaves. They have cell phones. How much of that existed in the middle class in the 1950s?
Obviously not microwaves and cell phones, which hadn't been invented yet. But this is always I think your relevant comparison would be how secure did people feel in a little middle-class lifestyle in, let us say, not 1953, but let's say 1970 versus now. I think people are much less secure in that style. And yes, some things are much better. Other things are worse. People were more sure that their local public school would give their children a decent education in 1970 than they are today. People were more sure that their company retirement fund would continue to cover them, that they actually had a secure retirement. People were less terrified that they would lose health insurance and be bankrupted by medical costs.
I would agree with you, and I think it's macroeconomics and the policies, Keynesian policies, that got us in this position, and what will get us out, in my belief, and I'd like your view on this, is if we create jobs, private sector jobs, And how you do that is the question. If we create jobs that will generate revenue for the government and will create investment, I disagree with you on savings. I think savings is a good thing, not a bad thing. And if you look at the spending we've been doing here in the federal level, spending isn't the answer. But if we create opportunity so we can create jobs, and by doing that, I think you remove the uncontrollable costs that employers are facing today. Those costs are all driven by the government. But reduce or remove those costs. Having more jobs in America is one of the things that we're looking for, is it not? And how do we get to that?
Two things. First, nothing in the experience of the last 2 decades suggests that supports at all the view that changing taxes in the range that's under discussion is going to be a bad thing for job creation. We have as close to a controlled experiment as you ever get in economics. We had one president who came in, raised taxes, raised the top marginal rate, was followed by an extraordinary explosion of job creation. And then the next president cut the top marginal rate, and even before the recession took place, job creation was quite anemic. So there's nothing in that record. You can say, well, there were other factors, but there's certainly nothing in that record to support a hardline view that any increase in taxes is going to be destructive of jobs, and that cutting taxes is always the way to create them. It just didn't work that way in the past 20 years. The view that as long as the microeconomics, the private sector is all good, then nothing bad can happen to the economy is completely belied by economic history. The U.S. economy of the 1920s was a marvel. It was more creative, arguably, than it has ever been. It was full of driving innovation, full of remarkable new business ideas. And then something terrible happened. And I guess my basic view is, by all means, entrepreneurship, innovation, productivity are wonderful things, but one Great Depression can ruin your whole day.
Well, thank you for being very generous with your time, our committee's time, Mr. Chairman. I just think if you look at, for example, the 90s, the tax increase was followed by a limiting the growth of government during the 90s. We limited the growth of government, and that coupled with revenues, as you say, increased, was what allowed us to balance the budget for 4 consecutive years. And my concern is if we don't control the growth of government, no matter what we do, is going to be a problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Lowy.
Thank you very much. And as an admirer and read your column, many of us look at it as the truth. So we're very happy that you're out there. For many of us, discussing wages and standard of living without acknowledging the impact that the economic crisis is having on families across the country certainly isn't adequate. And one of the most troubling aspects that I see is that almost every check in place to prevent this kind of disaster failed. For example, if a lender approved a loan likely to fail, an underwriter responsible for verifying the income on the application should have flagged the loan. When that didn't happen, and investment firms on Wall Street began buying bad mortgages and bundling them into securities, executives there should have investigated the mortgage's level of risk, which they didn't because they were all making so much money. And even if both the lenders and investment banks were not effective in weeding out bad loans, rating agencies charged with analyzing the risk of mortgage-backed securities should have been raising red flags. Yet in case after case, each of these levels, from the lender to the underwriter to the investment firms to the rating agencies, there was monumental failure. Now, many of us recognize that there isn't a silver bullet solution to solving the crisis, and it will take a combination of approaches, and I appreciate your mentioning healthcare, and as we know, this is a prime focus of this administration, this president. I wonder, and I read your column the day after, or it was probably the day of Geithner's presentation of his plan,
Right.
And the market soared. Now, there are many out there who will say, well, the market is soaring. Geithner is right. Summers is right. Krugman is wrong. I wonder, from you, what can be done to change both the industry and the culture that led to the poor decisions and investments that harmed our economy? And how do we prevent this happening again? I will speak to many of my constituents. My district is very varied, but many will say, oh, it's just a cycle. You know, it goes up and it goes down, and don't worry about it. And then they see the market going up, and then can be a great big movement. Okay, things are working again, forgetting the greed and the 40-to-1 leverage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we make these changes? Are you confident that we can do it, given the fact that health care will remain key on the agenda?
Okay, Ms. Lowy. About the market reaction.
They didn't read your column.
My old teacher, Paul Samuelson, famously said that the market had predicted 9 of the last 5 recessions. More contemporaneously, though still showing my age a bit, I'd say that the market thought that pets.com was a great idea. So you don't want to play too much weight, certainly, on what happens on a day or even a year in the market. What I would say about there is a fundamental philosophical, you might say, debate, which you'll probably read a bit more about in my next column, about whether the system of finance that we developed, not just these past couple of years, but over the past quarter century or more, was fundamentally a good idea or a deeply, deeply flawed system. And I believe that the administration still thinks it was mostly a good thing. I think that's a point of difference between them and myself. We went to a model, we went from the old model in which there were banks, and banks made loans and they held on to those loans, to a model of highly securitized finance, where a loan originator would make a loan and then sell off the loan, which would then be sliced and diced and turned into more complex financial instruments. What we know for sure is that the incentives in our financial system were deeply, deeply flawed. Essentially, if you were a manager in that system, you made a great deal of money by creating the appearance of profit. And even if the whole thing blew up after 5 years, you would walk away with a large sum of money. And at some level, ultimately, getting the compensation schemes right is critical. I think we can also ask ourselves, and I'll just try to end this, do we have too much finance in this country? I've been working on this a bit and noticing that during the 1960s, the finance sector was about 4% of GDP. In recent years, it's been 8% of GDP. Is that extra 4% of GDP creating value, or is it, I'm now starting to think, actually destroying it?
We are going to have to hold people to 5 minutes, or some members will not get a chance to question Dr. Krugman before he leaves at 11:30. So I'm sorry to say the woman's time has expired.
I have to go back to my hearing, and hopefully we'll have another session at Rosa DeLauro's house,
Yes.
where we enjoyed you. And Elizabeth Warren came the other night, and she agrees with you.
I'm sure Betsy does, yes.
Mr. Alexander.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doctor, on the second page in your testimony, you said, talking about the dysfunctional healthcare system, we spend more to cover 85% of our population than our counterparts spend to cover everyone, with no evidence that we receive correspondingly better care. Could one assume after reading that you are implying that if we cover everyone, we would both get it cheaper and better?
Yes, that is, we just take the issue of administrative costs. Private Medicare, which is, although we don't think of it this way often, is a single-payer system covering Americans 65 and older, spends about 3% of its budget on administration. Private health insurance companies spend approximately 14%, even though most of their practice is group coverage through corporations, which is be relatively cheap. The best available estimates suggest that the U.S. system spends about 30% of its total on administration, whereas other countries' systems spend on the order of half that. This is that why are our administrative costs so high? Essentially because of the cost of underwriting, insurance companies attempting to figure out who not to cover, and because of attempt to shift the costs onto someone else. It's a very high cost imposed by the non-universality of coverage. And if you try and look at who the uninsured are and what it would cost, just on the administrative cost savings alone, it ought to be cheaper in total to cover everybody than to do what we now do.
Okay, and also I find it puzzling, you said that comparing the amount of money, cash that's in the system today, we're 8% versus 4% at some time in the past. If that's the case, then why do we have those excited about the idea that the Treasury might inject yet another $1 trillion into the system? If you are implying that we already have too much cash, might be the problem.
As you may have gathered, I was not fond of the plan announced by the Treasury this week. And there's a great difference between the measures that the Federal Reserve has been undertaking, which are an attempt to promote new lending, and the Treasury plan, which is simply an attempt to pour money into the existing banks without necessarily coming out and lending in the other side. We do have a problem that financial institutions, some of the key ones, are crippled by inadequate capital. And we need to find a means of recapitalizing them. But that's not the same thing as saying that we want the sector to expand. And no, I think we do need to face up. We will eventually have to face up to the notion that there is not going to be as much of a finance sector as we had in 2006, and that it will be a good thing when it becomes a smaller part of our economy than it has been in recent years.
And if it appeared that I was implying you were excited about it, I apologize. I didn't intend to. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
May I say, if you are an owner of bank stock, the notion that the Treasury is about to throw $1 trillion in your general direction would probably be regarded as a good thing, regardless of whether it works or not.
We've sensed there is some excitement out there.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Krugman. It's a pleasure to have you here this morning. I'm going to pass on the temptation to talk about the financial situation, but let me move because I think this whole issue, one that has been a real concern to me over the years, is the whole issue of income disparity. And you say in your testimony that when reducing income inequality, and this is a quote, there is little reason to be confident about the efficacy of whatever measures we try. Let me ask, why such pessimism? If you were at the helm of a policymaking institution like
Yes.
this institution, what are some of the ideas that you would develop and implement to try to turn this around? You point to health care, and I understand that as something that we need to do and something that we can work at. What else? Where else would you prioritize in terms of this issue?
I'm sorry you asked that question. It is. Let me say quickly two things. The great leveling of the American income distribution, the great compression, which took place under FDR, took place under extraordinary circumstances. First, there was a tripling of the size of the union movement, thanks to the combination of the Depression and a change in the political environment. And secondly, there was World War II, which was a great equalizing factor. And the important lesson from that was that those changes stuck for 30 years. That it turned out that having altered in effect, the bargaining position of different of American workers, we got a more equal distribution which lasted a long time without any adverse economic effects. So that's the great inspiring lesson. But since we are not planning to have a second Great Depression and a third World War, I hope, it's going to be difficult to carry out measures on anything like that scale. What we can do are, I think, on two fronts. Some of the increase in inequality reflects increasing disparities based on educational level training skill. And so we can certainly, it's almost certainly a good thing to invest in better education, especially for not at the highest end, but for the population at large, training. But my read says that that's probably going to have only a modest impact on inequality, even if we do a lot of it. The second thing we can do is try to enhance the bargaining power of workers. And I'm very much a supporter of the Employee Free Choice Act, which is the cutting edge of that discussion right now. There is no fundamental reason in people who say that a stronger labor movement doesn't make sense in the 21st century, I think are missing the realities. They're thinking that modern labor negotiations have to look exactly like the industrial labor negotiations of 40 years ago to be effective, and I don't think that's right. But the reason for my pessimism is that we are not sure. If you ask me to put a number on what passage of EFCA would do to the Gini coefficient, I have no idea. If you ask me what would comprehensive health care reform do to the number of uninsured, I can be quite exact and highly optimistic about that.
I'm going to yield back my time, Mr. Chairman, because I'm going to the Budget Committee where we're going to do battle and to see if every time we get to thinking about where the cuts ought to be made, it winds up in the non-defense discretionary portion of the budget, which is where you have health care and where you have education and some of the issues that might, in fact, make a difference in people's lives. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Krugman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Krugman, I'm going to steer away from your testimony today because I feel like some of my colleagues will take an opportunity to talk to you about that, and I'd like to focus on a couple articles that you wrote recently. One, February 1st, Protectionism and Stimulus, and on March 16th, A Continent Adrift. Let me give you a quick update on my thoughts, and then more importantly, I'd like to hear from you on yours. Last week, many of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle took the opportunity to rush to the microphones and I know sincerely, but nevertheless express their outrage and dismay over the fact that there were bonuses that had been allowed for some of the small number of employees at AIG. And the president was outraged over it, and we were all outraged over it, although we never really answered the question, who actually instructed Senator Dodd to take the language out of the conference committee that would have addressed this issue in the stimulus bill. One of the reasons I opposed the stimulus bill was an easy one for me, but a harder one to explain to some of my colleagues, and that was there was also a Buy American provision in it. Now, every member of this committee is American. Probably every person in this room is American. And we're all for Buy America, to create American jobs. And yet the example I used with a Steel Caucus hearing was, we have a company in Germany, ThyssenKrupp, that invested 2 years ago $4.5 billion of their money to come to the United States to create jobs in America. 20,000 construction jobs right now. They actually were looking at Louisiana, but we ended up bringing them to Alabama. So we were grateful to have them come. These are good-paying jobs with good-paying health benefits, and they will replace lower-wage jobs in the textile industry and the timber industry jobs, many of which have gone offshore. And yet one of the provisions, and I talked with Secretary Summers about this, was that in an effort to wrap our arms around American jobs, we ended up saying, okay, you can come invest $4.5 billion, create 20,000 construction jobs, 2,700 permanent jobs, but by the way, you can't sell any of the steel that you happen to manufacture to the U.S. Department of Transportation because that's not American, even though those jobs and the product would actually be finished here. So since you opined in a couple columns about what's going on in Europe and specifically also about the Buy American provision in the stimulus, I'd like for you to help me understand from your perspective, do we run a risk when we rush to judgment about an issue and hold up something as popular as Buy American, in setting off a trade war, in building up walls of isolationism, much like we did in the 1920s and 30s, do we run a risk of actually do more harm than good with policies like that? And I apologize for the confusion of the question.
Right. No, that's it wasn't confused at all. It's actually, this is exactly the issue of which I have to talk at my next engagement today. So let me say where we are. The problem with protectionism of any form, and the Buy America provision is not the grossest form of protection, but it's certainly a step in that direction. The problem with it is that it's very hard to undo. The relatively open world trading system that we have now has been a very good thing for the world. Less so, I would say, I think not so much about American workers, where there are some ambiguous effects, but for the poorest countries. So when someone asks me why is relatively free trade important, my answer is think about Bangladesh, think about the poorest countries which cannot survive unless they can export their products. That relatively open system we have now took 70 years to create. After the highly protectionist responses that the world undertook during the Great Depression, it took generations of painstaking, slow negotiations to basically get back to where we started. And if you smash it apart right now, putting Humpty Dumpty back together again might take another 3 generations. So that's the reason to be extremely cautious about it. You do not want to say, I think it's incorrect to say that protectionism caused the Great Depression, or even to say that protectionism would necessarily make our current crisis worse. The temptation, in particular, given that the United States is being more aggressive in grappling with this crisis than the Europeans are, the temptation to say, well, let's keep the benefits of our stimulus at home is real and not foolish. But if you think about the costs, think about what could happen if we break up this system, which has been so hard won, those are very serious to worry about.
Let me thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me also apologize to my colleagues who may not know that I was here on time at the appropriate beginning of the hearing, but Congresswoman Lowy and I are trapped in a dueling hearing across the hall, and I wanted to make sure that they were understanding of why the queue is reflective of the way it is, and I thank the chairman. Professor Krugman, I know that you have concerns about the public-private partnership presented by Secretary Geithner on Monday. A number of us do, and some of the concerns that you have articulated are clear to many of us, and there are certain hazards associated with the public-private partnership offered by the Secretary. But I wanted to present to you another concept of public-private partnerships written about by your colleague Bob Herbert at the New York Times just a week or two ago. The Congress of the United States has been trying, and a number of states have been trying, to attract more private investment in public works projects. A little different than the bank rescue plan, but nevertheless, there is an acknowledgement by this institution that there is sufficient private capital available to build and expand the domestic economy and the domestic job creation base by attracting private capital to public works projects if the private investors can find a way in a public works project to get their profit out of the project. Obviously combining the best of public governance with the best of private experience, there is a potential match made in heaven. Bob Herbert specifically talked about an airport, a greenfield airport outside of my congressional district that could provide an opportunity to provide initially 15,000 jobs, but upon its final expansion, nearly 350,000 jobs to the local economy. No public works project does for an area what an airport does. With an airport comes, for example, the accelerator and the multiplier effect. Hyatt, Hilton, UPS, Federal Express, DHL, et cetera. Could you distinguish for the committee the difference between many state efforts, many local efforts, and including federal efforts to encourage private investment in public-private partnerships from the kind of public-private partnership that Secretary Geithner articulated with respect to banks, and share with us some of the hazards associated with the latter?
There is no, thank you. There is no problem with bringing the private sector in on a project. It's a pragmatic issue. If the financing can be more easily arranged, if the expertise that private firms can bring to a project can be best brought in, not simply by hiring them as a contractor, but by making them a stakeholder, that's fine. It's really, if you go through American economic history, you can find that we've done things in a variety of ways. The Erie Canal was a straight public works project, but the building of the Transcontinental Railroad was essentially what they didn't call it at the time, but was a public-private partnership where land grants were used to encourage the railroads to do the job. The issue about the PPIP really has nothing to do with these things. My way of understanding what Secretary Geithner has presented is that it is, in essence, the same plan that former Secretary Paulson presented 6 months ago. It is really, it is a proposal to have the taxpayer buy up a bunch of assets at more than anyone in the private sector is currently willing to pay. It's disguised a little bit, or at least it's made obscure, by the complexity of the financing scheme and by the fact that the headline number of public investment is not going to be quite as large. But what it really does is it gives the private equity investors, in effect, I'm being a little inflammatory here, but it basically bribes private investors to go out and buy the toxic assets. It offers them what is in effect a large put option, because the FDIC is guaranteeing debt, which is 85% of the total, and if things go bad, the investors can simply walk away. So that if the investments turn out to be bad, there's a strong element of heads they win, tails the taxpayer loses. Now that's being defended by Treasury on the grounds that these assets are in fact being greatly undervalued, and that what we really need is a large subsidy to make people buy it. But it has nothing to do. This is buying up toxic paper from troubled banks is not at all like building an airport.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's a pleasure to listen to our testimony, and your prepared statement is, for a person who didn't study economics, is easier to read for me. The question I have is, there's a lot of debate on measuring economic growth and measuring inequities in our system within our population. The measures that we use is what I hear is GDP. Are there other measures that would be more precise, that would create a greater contrast in what you are trying to talk about using GDP? Is there another way of doing that so that it's more precise and perhaps even more on point?
Congressman, I'm tempted to act professorial and say that's a good question, which is a way of playing for time because you don't actually know the answer yourself. What I would say is first off that no serious economist believes that GDP is a sufficient measure of economic success. That we all know, every Principles of Economics textbook, including my own, has a couple of pages on what GDP does not do. And simply having a higher GDP does not necessarily tell you the actual improvement in the quality of life. It helps to use some measure which comes closer to the experience of the typical family, which is why people like myself often focus on things like median family income. But even that misses quite a lot. Whether there's a single measure that can capture all of what we want to talk about is highly dubious. People have tried to do that. They always end up being somewhat arbitrary constructions. If we look at, to take the example, if we're comparing the United States and France, we have substantially higher GDP per capita. We have approximately the same labor productivity. The difference is partially that they have higher unemployment, but largely that they just take longer vacations than we do. Is that how much of that is a loss and how much of that is simply a different choice? For what it's worth, gross changes in GDP almost always reflect comparable changes in any measure of the quality of life. There's no question that if you have country A, which has twice the GDP per capita of country B, country A is going to be a happier country. But I think you're asking too much to have a single number. That what we use GDP, we use a few other measures, but then we're not so much presenting a number as telling a story. What is it like in this country? What is it like in our society?
I wasn't looking for a single metric. I thought maybe there might be a series of metrics out there that can be used to contrast one epoch to another. And
we certainly have life expectancy, infant mortality. We have survey results about life satisfaction, which tell you something about how people perceive their lives. We have measures of household security or lack thereof. All of these things come together. They don't. There's not a whole lot of difference between rankings of countries by simple GDP per capita and rankings by these others, but there are some important differences, and particularly more equal, less insecure societies look better, rank better on most of these measures than looking at GDP would have told you.
Thank you.
Ms. Lee.
First, thank you for being here, but also thank you for your testimony, Dr. Krugman, and also how you kind of break down economic analysis as it relates to public policy. I think, I always read your columns and your articles, and in looking at your testimony today, it's very consistent with ordinary folks being able to read and understand what's taking place in the economy and what we need to consider as we move forward. Wanted to just mention one of your comments in your testimony. You talked about the poverty rates in a boom year was about 12.5%. I would have added, in addition, for people of color, for instance, for African Americans, it was 24.5% to 27.9%. For Latinos, 21.5% to 27.1%. I wanted to ask you how, and we understand, the environment we're currently in terms of the consideration of race. Race and class has always been a big issue in this country, and I want to find out, as it relates to the poverty rates now, how you see race. Is it still a factor? What would you say would account for these huge gaps? I mean, 12.5% is bad enough, but when you go to 24 to 27, 21 to 27, that's twice as bad. And so by leaving out communities of color, people of color, does that send a different type of message that race is not a factor anymore in our economic strategies? Or how do you see this at this point with quite naturally, President Obama as president?
I think there's only so much I can say here. One is that clearly there are large racial differences in poverty rates and income. While we like to emphasize that majority of the poor in the United States, contrary to popular impression, are not in fact African American, certainly the poverty rates are much higher among African Americans. And it would be clearly foolish to suppose that simply because we have finally had an African American president, that race has ceased to be an issue in America. It's very much still an issue, very much still a large part of our social scene, of our economic scene. The causes of the racial differences are probably complex. I, for one, do not believe that discrimination has ceased to be a factor. I do not believe that we wiped away all of our centuries of history. I believe it's a real issue. There are also social issues. There are simple, persistent issues. Referring to some of the remarks we had earlier, we are not a society of perfect social mobility. There's actually a great deal of heritability of economic status. And the fact that we had undeniably vast discrimination in this country not that long ago continues to color our income distribution, our poverty rates today. And I think we can't, now many of the things we can do to mitigate suffering, to mitigate poverty, can be colorblind, even though we're aware of the issues of race. Universal health care is going to be good for people. Probably the biggest beneficiaries, certainly rates of uninsurance are highest among African Americans, but that doesn't mean that you have to think about that in devising the program. You simply have universal coverage, and it serves those most vulnerable especially well. Other things, certainly we need to take them into account. This is not, I would agree with the President, race is our original sin in this country. We have made far more progress in coming to terms with that over the past 50 years than many would have imagined, but we have certainly not come past it.
Thank you very much. And the second question I have is with regard to income inequality and this recent, you know, I would say the recent unethical and immoral and possibly criminal behavior by many of the, you know, Wall Street firms as it relates to the bonuses. I have a bill. It's the Income Equity Act. And what I'm trying to do is close some of these loopholes that would allow these unlimited kinds of bonuses. But what this bill would do would be to only allow the deduction of $500,000 or more, $500,000, 25 times the pay of the lowest wage worker to receive a federal tax deduction.
Could I ask you to be very brief in the answer? Gentlewoman's time is expired.
Yes, I cannot respond without knowing much more than I do about the bill. I'm all in favor of seeking ways to limit this, and certainly some of the deeply unjust tax privileges that some people in the financial industry have received.
I'll
But
send you
beyond
a copy
that, I
of the
can't
bill.
go.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Roybal-Allard.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Krugman, in your book, Confronting Inequality, you state that the principle of equality of opportunity, not equality of results, is a largely fictitious distinction. Could you elaborate on what you mean by that?
Yes, it's often stated that, well, what we want is equality of opportunity, and that doesn't mean everybody has to end up in the same place. But if you have a highly unequal society, as we do, the children of those who do well are given a great advantage. The children of those who do poorly are put at a great disadvantage. And I did, in the book, in Conscience of a Liberal, I cited the studies on educational attainment versus socioeconomic status, where it turns out that high-scoring students as of 8th grade from the bottom quartile measured by socioeconomic status are less likely to graduate college than low-scoring students from the top quartile on socioeconomic status. Loosely speaking, that rich dumb kids are more likely to make it through college than poor smart kids. And that's telling you that we are a society in which, whatever we may like to imagine, we are not a society that has anything like equality of opportunity, that there's strong passing down through the generations of social and economic status.
Okay. You go on also to say that this high inequality imposes serious costs on our society that goes beyond the purchasing power. And one of the things that you give an example of is how it corrupts politics. Could you elaborate on that and maybe give some other examples?
Yes, we certainly see that our political system is utterly democratic on paper and much less so in reality. That we can see, I think everyone on this panel knows better than I do, the role of money, of influence, and simply of voice. That in a society where many people are poorly educated, scraping by, their voices are not heard in our political system. It undermines. We are people who are extreme views would need to say that we're a democracy in name only and really an oligarchy. I think we're better than that. But there's certainly a grain of truth to that. It's a system that does not. My colleague Larry Bartels in the politics department at Princeton has shown that really the bottom third of the U.S. population is entirely ignored by the political process. That the views of the poorer constituents, even lower income working people, are essentially ignored by the process, and that's not the country we should be.
Is my time up, Mr. Chairman?
No.
No, okay.
1 minute left.
So basically what you're saying is that although we as Americans like to think that in this country we have equal opportunities, that basically that is a fantasy, and that not only that we do not have equal opportunities, but that is reflected in equal results that negatively impacts the ability of people to move upward in our society?
That's right. We still see ourselves as a society of Horatio Alger stories, and they do happen, but they happen much more rarely than people imagine. And for what it's worth, we are less a society of Horatio Alger stories at this point than some other advanced countries. The chance of somebody born in the bottom quintile of making it into wealth or even a substantial affluence is less in the United States than in Canada or Finland, largely because of things like the inadequacy of our healthcare system. So we're still, there are opportunities. We're not a caste society, but we're not the kind of wide open society that we hold up to ourselves as an ideal and sometimes imagine that we actually fulfill in practice.
Okay. And as a result, we are all impacted
That's
by
right.
this inequality, regardless of where we are on the income step.
We are, we're at the level of value judgments at some level, but we are more, well, let me just say one thing. We're certainly wasting a great deal of human potential. Those smart kids from the bottom quartile who don't manage to make it through college essentially because they're so disadvantaged, that's talent that we could use, that we need.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate it. I enjoy reading your column during the week, and I've enjoyed your books, and I think you have provided a lot of guidance for those of us who are trying to deal with a lot of these issues. I represent a district that is in northeast Ohio, Youngstown, Akron, who have been hit in a major way, not just recently, but I think over the course of the last 25 or 30 years. And you can see where our local economy is based on what has happened just in the past few months. We see a General Motors plant who gets rid of a third shift, gets rid of a second shift, and 3 or 4 days later, the seat manufacturer lays off a couple hundred people, and a few days later, the logistics company lays off a few more people, and Delphi, and right down the line. And so my question is in two parts. One is an issue that I think the Secretary of Treasury kind of tipped his hat at a little bit early on, is the issue of China, currency manipulation in China. What your thoughts are on that, and maybe how we can address that as a Congress. And from the administration perspective. And then also, as I stated earlier, how the ripple effect of manufacturing and how manufacturing leads to more job creation than the financial sector. And I know you mentioned earlier about going from 4% of our GDP to 8% of our GDP as finance, and that would be healthy if that gets reduced back to 4%. So something's got to fill that void. Is it manufacturing? How can we put together a good comprehensive manufacturing policy in the United States? So China currency and a manufacturing policy. And you have 4 minutes to solve that.
Right. China currency policy. I think I was struck by Secretary Geithner's excessive clarity. It seemed to me that was a case where a little bit of Greenspan clouds of words that was appropriate. It's a very difficult issue. Of course, China is manipulating its currency. They got those $2 trillion of reserves somehow. The question is what you want to do about it. And that's a very tricky issue, especially given that while on one hand we don't like those Chinese exports competing with U.S. goods, although that's not as great an issue as people imagine. But on the other hand, we don't want them abruptly dumping all their dollars. So it's a tricky issue for which I have no good answers. It's just one of those things that one hopes just fades away.
Is now a bad time to try to address that?
Probably now is a bad time. Let me just say right now, the woes of manufacturing, and I think this is the crucial thing right now, this is not that U.S. jobs are being stolen by other people. Manufacturing is in a catastrophic state around the world. It's collapsing everywhere because of the severity of the economic slump. Just this morning, we had the news that Japan's exports have fallen 50% over the past year. Just catastrophic collapse in their exports of manufactured goods. Same thing is happening to China. Same thing is happening to Germany. So the urgent thing that we need right now is not how can we get some slightly bigger share of this global manufacturing pie, but how do we stop this? I'm going to have trouble with my metaphor here, but how do we stop this pie from shrinking to insignificance for all of us? So what we're facing, there are longer-term manufacturing issues, but right now, what we need is economic recovery. We need to do whatever we can do to get it. And manufacturing is on the leading edge, is paying the biggest costs from the slump, and would then be the biggest beneficiary if we can get a recovery.
Do you see the green revolution? Some people kind of poo-poo the idea that a green revolution can lead to resuscitating manufacturing in the United States. We have a lot of little machine shops that are making the bolts that go in the windmills. I mean, is that a realistic, from a policy perspective, is that a realistic expectation that all of this investment in green technology will lead to reviving manufacturing?
It would help. I think it's unrealistic to expect manufacturing ever to be the same share of GDP that it was 30 years ago. Just as it's unrealistic to expect us ever to go back to a country where a large proportion of the population is farmers. There is a transition. Everyone has moved towards becoming increasingly a service economy. But manufacturing is especially depressed right now. It could come back significantly. The whole green investment, green spending is real. I haven't been able to form any judgment of my own about how big it will be ultimately. It certainly will be a factor, but how big, I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Don't worry, you're not going to miss anything. So I would simply give Mr. Tiart 1 minute for whatever summary thoughts he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Krugman, for being with us. It's been very enlightening. I enjoyed your conversation and your positions. I would disagree with your colleague about the poorer class or the lower class being ignored by the political process. I know that Ms. Lee and Chairman Obey and others here pay a great deal of attention to it, and I would argue with him that they do have access to Medicaid, EITC, public schools, unemployment, and they do vote. And we all realize that, and so we pay a lot more attention to them than your colleague may realize. I just want to conclude by saying that my concern in the direction that the country is going ignores the fact that a rising tide raises all boats. And when we have a strong economy, even those who do not have access to college have access to opportunity. And if we can provide access to opportunity, those that don't complete college, Bill Gates would probably be the most large example, but others do take that opportunity and bring these ideas to the marketplace, and it's those private sector jobs that help us keep the lights on in the federal government and at the state and local governments. So my concern is, how do we raise the tide? And your input, I think, has helped give me a different perspective on some of the things that we're looking at. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I guess all I would say is that I would like to think that in all cases, a rising tide lifts all boats. The problem is that, as has been said by others in the past, at some times in our recent history, it appears that a rising tide has raised only all yachts. Let me say that I appreciate your comments today. I think it's important to hear what you said with respect to the stimulus package when you indicated that there is no great certainty that the need for stimulating the economy will evaporate within a year and a half. I certainly don't think it's going to. I wish I did. With respect to your acknowledgement of the difficulties that we have in trying to reduce inequality, I guess all I would say is that I do believe that whether directly or indirectly, we can at least impact that around the edges by what we do to enhance educational opportunity, by what we do to strengthen the bargaining position of workers at the bargaining table. We certainly can impact their welfare by the shape and nature of the tax code, and we can certainly strengthen the safety net for those who don't do well in the economy through actions such as universal health care and pension protection and the like. If you'd like to comment for a minute before you leave, the floor is yours.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I would very much agree. The fact that you don't know just how much effect you're going to get from a policy, but you think is not a reason not to do it if you think it'll move things in the right direction. And I believe that education, enhanced opportunities for labor to organize would help reduce inequality. I think I'm thinking a little bit as an author. When I wrote my last book, but one, I put healthcare first because that was the one where I thought I could promise some very specific results. And I put reducing inequality as a more of a, here's some things we ought to try, and they would probably all help, but I don't know how much. And that's not to say we shouldn't do them. We can do a lot better than this. I think that the main point is that we have a tremendously vital private sector. We have entrepreneurship. We have innovation. What we don't have is an adequate way of making sure that all Americans are benefiting from what that private sector creates. And we can do much better at that than we have been doing. Thank you.
I'm into that. Thank you very much. Good luck at your next engagement.
Thank you.
Let me next call our second panel. First, Dr. Keith Hall, who is currently Commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Dr. Hall has led the Bureau since January of 2008, having been appointed Commissioner by President Bush. He's also served as Chief Economist for the White House Council on Economic Advisors and the Department of Commerce and International Trade Commission. Dr. Joan Fitzgerald, Director of the Law Policy and Society Program at Northeastern University in Boston, is the author of Moving Up in the New Economy, Career Ladders for U.S. Workers, and has written extensively about models for training and career advancement in the healthcare sector. I understand that Mr. Honda would like to briefly introduce Ms. Phaedra Ellis-Lampkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee. I'd like to introduce a personal friend, Ms. Phaedra Ellis-Lampkins. Phaedra hails from San Jose, California, and is the CEO of Green for All, an organization dedicated to building an inclusive green economy, fighting pollution and poverty together. Prior to her position at Green for All, she was the head of the South Bay Labor Council and Working Partnerships in Santa Clara County. She is nationally recognized for her creative and innovative approaches to improving the lives of working families and her brilliant, charismatic leadership style. And I don't think I'm embarrassing her yet, but I'll get there. She's co-founded the Partnership for Working Families, a national coalition to bring the principles of good jobs and community benefits to local economic development. She fought to create one of the first community benefits agreements in the country, providing community standards for large-scale development projects in San Jose. She has been featured in Wall Street Journal Online, San Francisco Chronicle, San Jose Mercury News, America at Work, NBC News, and ABC News. Finally, she serves on the board of the Leadership Council of California. She has many other accomplishments that I could name, but in the interest of time, Mr. Chairman, let me just extend a warm welcome to her today.
Thank you. Ms. Lee, I understand you wanted to make a comment.
Well, just welcome and congratulations to you. Now, of course, we share her as the new CEO for Green for All, now with Van Jones, advising our president and our country on the greening of our economy and ensuring that no one will be left behind. I really thank you very much for your leadership and for making this transition now, and we look forward to working with you, of course, in Oakland, California also. Thank you.
We share good.
I'm going to forego my opening statement for this panel because I'm informed that we're about to have 3 votes beginning sometime after 11:45. This place would function very well if we didn't have to interrupt our work to go vote. But that's part of the job. So what I would hope we could do is get each of you to get your statements in before we have to leave. When we do leave, we'll be gone for about half an hour, I'm afraid. So I'd like to squeeze as much in as we can before we leave. Dr. Hall, why don't you proceed first? Take about 5 minutes to summarize your statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the Bureau of Labor Statistics occupational outlook information with you. I would like to provide a very brief overview of the current economy and then discuss long-term employment trends through 2016. In light of the committee's interest in health care, I will address this field specifically. Finally, concerning a topic of current intense interest, green jobs, I want to briefly discuss the challenge of measuring the number and characteristics of these jobs. As you know, the nation is in the midst of a sharp and widespread contraction of the labor market. Since the start of the recession, 4.4 million payroll jobs have been lost, and the unemployment rate has increased from 4.9% to 8.1%, the highest level in over 25 years. Job losses have occurred in nearly all major industry sectors, and employment has grown only in healthcare, private education, and government. Unemployment is up among all major demographic groups, and the number of people working part-time and voluntarily has jumped to 4 million. Job losses have occurred throughout the economy, as 4 states now have an unemployment rate above 10%. The BLS prepares long-term national projections every 2 years, including the labor force, industry output, and industry and occupational employment. The most recent projections were published for the 2006 to 2016 period. We rely on data from a number of BLS programs, including the Current Employment Statistics, Occupational Employment Statistics, the Current Population Survey, and the Producer Price Index. We also use data from other federal statistical agencies, primarily the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Economic Analysis. I want to first note that the 2006 to 2016 projections were completed before the current recession. The impact of the recession and financial market turmoil on the long-run structure of the economy may not be known for some time and may well impact the long-term trends that are the focus of our projection analysis. For example, we don't yet know if recent large declines in retirement wealth may impact future labor force participation rates of older workers. To put the occupational projections in the context, let me briefly review the broad trends. We expect growth in the labor force and total employment to slow, and the decline in manufacturing employment and shift towards services employment to continue. We expect that employment in manufacturing, mining, and the federal government and utilities will all decline. All other major industry groups are projected to gain jobs, with the most rapid job growth expected in healthcare and social assistance, professional and business services, and educational services. Total employment is expected to grow 10% over the decade, resulting in 15.6 million new jobs. The two groups with the largest employment in 2006, professional and related occupations and service occupations, are also expected to grow faster than other groups, each increasing by 17%. Both include occupations within the large and fast-growing healthcare and social assistance and professional and business services industries, such as registered nurses, home health aides, and computer software engineers. These two groups also represent the opposite ends of education and earnings ranges. Many occupations in the professional and related group pay wages above median for all occupations and require higher levels of education or training, while many service occupations pay lower wages and require less education and training. So far, I've mentioned only job growth. However, job openings arise not only when new jobs are added to the economy, but also when existing jobs become permanently vacant, such as when workers retire. These replacement needs are expected to generate more than twice as many job openings as job growth alone. The retirement of the baby boom generation will create many replacement openings, but replacement needs will be significant in any large occupation, even some that were not expected to grow. Also, many rapid growing